On a cold March night in 1770, the streets of Boston were filled with tension, fear, and anger. The city had been on edge for months, and everyone knew something terrible was about to happen. British soldiers patrolled the streets, muskets in hand, while townspeople muttered curses under their breath. The redcoats had come to keep order, but their presence only made things worse. It was in this uneasy atmosphere that a simple argument between a few men turned into one of the most infamous events in American history, the Boston Massacre. To understand how it all began, we have to go back a few years. The American colonies were growing fast. More people, more trade, and more ambition. But Great Britain, far across the ocean, still ruled them. After the costly French and Indian War, the British government was deep in debt. They believed the colonies should help pay for their own defense. So Parliament passed a series of taxes, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and later the Townshend Acts, that charged the colonists for everyday goods like paper, glass, paint, and tea. To the colonists, these taxes felt unfair. They had no representatives in Parliament, no one to speak for them. The famous phrase, "no taxation without representation," became their rallying cry. In Boston especially, resistance was fierce. The city's merchants and craftsmen organized boycotts, refusing to buy British goods. Groups like the Sons of Liberty, led by men such as Samuel Adams and John Hancock, stirred up public protests and urged people to stand against British control. As the protests grew louder, Britain decided to send troops to Boston to maintain order. In 1768, about 2,000 British soldiers, known as Redcoats for their bright scarlet uniforms, arrived in a town of only 16,000 people. Their arrival was like throwing a spark into dry grass. The soldiers were supposed to keep the peace, but they quickly became symbols of oppression. They competed with locals for jobs, they patrolled the streets at all hours, and they represented everything the colonists hated about British rule. Tensions grew with every passing week. The people of Boston saw the Redcoats as invaders. Children mocked them in the streets, calling them lobsterbacks. Shopkeepers refused to serve them. Even small arguments between soldiers and townsfolk sometimes turned into fistfights. The soldiers, for their part, resented the colonists' insults and constant defiance. They were far from home, poorly paid, and unwanted. It was only a matter of time before words turned into violence. On the evening of March 5, 1770, it began with something small, as such tragedies often do. Around 9 o'clock, a young apprentice named Edward Garrick shouted an insult at a British officer outside the custom house on King Street, accusing him of not paying a bill. A sentry named Private Hugh White, standing guard nearby, told him to be quiet. When Garrick kept taunting, White struck him with his musket. A crowd quickly formed. Angry voices filled the air. Snowballs, sticks, and chunks of ice were thrown at the soldier. Someone rang the town bell, usually used to signal a fire, and more people poured into the streets thinking there was an emergency. Within minutes, King Street was a chaos of shouts and movement. Dozens of colonists surrounded the lone soldier. They were armed with clubs, rope ends, and anything they could grab. "Kill him," someone shouted. Private White, now terrified, called for help. Captain Thomas Preston, hearing the commotion, marched to the scene with 7 more soldiers, their bayonets glinting in the torchlight. The soldiers lined up in front of the custom house, facing a mob of several hundred furious townspeople. The air was cold and sharp, and the snow crunched underfoot. The colonists jeered, daring the soldiers to shoot. Some yelled, "Fire if you dare!" Others threw more snowballs and chunks of ice. The soldiers, their hands shaking, tried to hold their ground. Captain Preston shouted for calm, warning his men not to fire. But in the confusion, in the noise and the fury, something happened. A stick struck one of the soldiers. Another slipped on the ice. A gun went off. The sound of that first shot tore through the night like thunder. The soldiers, startled and panicked, began firing one after another into the crowd. Smoke filled the air. Screams echoed down the narrow street. When the gunfire stopped, 5 men lay dead or dying in the snow, and several more were wounded. The first to fall was Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native American descent, a sailor who had been at the front of the crowd. He became the first to die for American liberty. Alongside him lay Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, Samuel Maverick, and Patrick Carr. Blood stained the frozen street red as the horrified crowd scattered. The shooting lasted less than a minute, but its impact would last for centuries. In the stunned silence that followed, Captain Preston ordered his men back to their barracks. Bells rang throughout Boston as word spread like wildfire. The soldiers had fired on the people. Within hours, thousands gathered in the streets, furious and afraid. The governor, Thomas Hutchinson, hurried to calm the crowd, promising that justice would be done. He ordered the soldiers arrested, including Captain Preston, who insisted he had not given the order to fire. The next day, the bodies of the victims were laid out for all to see. The city was in mourning and in rage. The Sons of Liberty seized the moment, printing pamphlets and spreading engravings that showed British soldiers firing cruelly into a peaceful crowd. The most famous image, created by Paul Revere, exaggerated the event, but burned it into public memory. It showed the redcoats lined up neatly, firing in unison at helpless colonists. It was powerful propaganda, and it worked. The colonists now saw the British not as protectors, but as oppressors. In the following weeks, Boston teetered on the edge of chaos. The British troops were withdrawn from the city to avoid more violence, but the damage had been done. The Boston Massacre had turned fear into fury, and fury into unity. Even those who had once hoped for peace began to question whether Britain's rule could ever be just. Yet not everyone wanted to see the soldiers hanged. John Adams, a respected lawyer and a strong supporter of colonial rights, agreed to defend Captain Preston and his men in court. He believed that everyone, even the enemy, deserved a fair trial. It was a bold move and a risky one, but Adams wanted to prove that the colonies valued justice and truth more than vengeance. The trial began in the fall of 1770. Witnesses gave conflicting stories. Some swore the soldiers had fired deliberately. Others said the mob had attacked first. Adams argued that the soldiers had been provoked, surrounded by an angry crowd, and afraid for their lives. After hearing all the evidence, the jury agreed that only 2 soldiers were guilty of manslaughter. The rest, including Captain Preston, were acquitted. Even so, the name Boston Massacre stuck, and its story spread across the colonies. Adams later wrote that facts are stubborn things. His defense may have saved the soldiers' lives, but it could not save Britain's reputation. The event had already become a symbol of tyranny. Colonial newspapers published fiery editorials. Sermons were preached about freedom and justice. Year after year, the people of Boston held memorials for the martyrs of the massacre, keeping their memory alive. The Boston Massacre didn't start the American Revolution, but it lit one of the first sparks. It united ordinary men and women in outrage and gave power to the growing movement for independence. When the Tea Act came 3 years later, leading to the Boston Tea Party, the people were ready to resist. When the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in 1775, many remembered the night when British guns had first turned on American citizens. Looking back, it's striking how small moments, a shouted insult, a snowball, a spark of anger, can change history. The Boston Massacre was just such a moment. It showed how quickly fear and pride could turn into bloodshed, but it also revealed the colonists' determination to stand up for their rights. Out of tragedy came purpose, and out of grief came a growing belief that freedom was worth fighting for. Today, the site of the Boston Massacre still exists, marked by a simple stone circle near the old State House. Tourists walk past, the traffic hums, and life moves on. But beneath that ordinary spot lies the memory of a night that shook an empire. The soldiers who fired their muskets could not have known that they were helping to write the first lines of a revolution. The crowd that faced them, angry and defiant, could not have imagined that within a few years, their protest would ignite a war for independence. The Boston Massacre remains a story of tragedy and transformation. It reminds us that history often turns on moments of chaos and courage. It was the night Boston streets ran red with blood, and the night the dream of liberty began to take shape. The colonists who mourned the dead would soon rise together to fight for a nation that did not yet exist. And in their struggle, the world would see the birth of something entirely new, the United States of America.